Inhabited Island. Part 1. Robinson. Chapter 1. Maxim opened the hatch slightly, leaned out and looked cautiously at the sky. The sky here was low and solid, without this frivolous transparency, hinting at the bottomlessness of space and the multiplicity of inhabited worlds. It was a true biblical firmament, smooth and impenetrable. This firmament undoubtedly rested on the mighty shoulders of local Atlanta and phosphorescent evenly. Maxim looked at the zenith for a hole pierced by the ship, but there was no hole there, only two big black blots blotted out there, like drops of mascara in water. Maxim opened the hatch wide open and jumped into the tall, dry grass. The air was hot and thick, it smelled of dust, old iron, crushed greenery, and life. It also smelled of death, old and incomprehensible. The grass was up to the waist, thickets of bushes were getting dark nearby, and dull, crooked trees were sticking out somehow. It was almost as bright as on a bright moonlit night on Earth, but there were no moonshadows and no moonlight blue. Everything was gray, dusty and flat. The ship was standing at the bottom of a huge basin with gentle slopes. The surrounding area rose noticeably towards the blurred, unclear horizon, and this was strange, because somewhere nearby there was a river flowing, big and calm, flowing west, up the slope of the basin. Maxim walked around the ship, moving his palm over its cold, slightly damp side. He found signs of the blows right where he expected. A deep, unpleasant dent under the indicator ring was when the ship was suddenly thrown up and stuck to one side, so that the cyberpilot was offended and Maxim had to quickly take control, and the notch near the right pupil was 10 seconds later, when the ship was put on its nose and screwed. Maxim looked at the zenith again. The black blots were now barely visible. A meteor attack in the stratosphere, the probability is 0 integers 00. But after all, every possible event does come true. Maxim slipped into the cabin, switched control to car repairs, used the express laboratory and headed for the river. An adventure, of course, but it's still a chore. Boredom. Even our adventures at GSP are routine. Meteor attack, radiation attack, landing accident. Landing crash, meteor attack, radiation attack. The adventures of the body. The tall, brittle grass rustled and crunched under my feet, and the prickly seeds dug into the shorts. With an itchy ringing sound, a cloud of midges flew in, cluttered in front of her face and fell behind. Respectable adults do not join the free search group. They have solid things to do for themselves, and they know that all these alien planets are, in fact, quite monotonous and tedious. They are monotonous and tedious. Tiresome and monotonous. Of course, if you are 20 years old, if you don't really know anything, if you don't really know what you would like to be able to do, if you haven't yet learned to value your main asset, time, if you don't have and don't expect any special talents, if your being at 20 years old, like 10 years ago, is not your head, but your arms and legs, if you are so primitive as to imagine it's like you can find some jewel on unknown planets that is impossible on Earth, if, then of course. Then take the catalog, open it on any page, point your finger at any line and fly to yourself. Discover a planet, call it by your own name, determine its physical characteristics, fight monsters, if there are any, make contacts, you'll find someone with Robinson. Little by little, you'll find no one. And it's not that it's all in vain. They will thank you, they will tell you that you have made your contribution, and a prominent specialist will call you for a detailed conversation. Students, especially those who are lagging behind and certainly in elementary school, will look at you with respect, but when they meet, the teacher will only ask, "Are you still in the GSP?" And he'll move the conversation to another topic, and his face will be guilty and sad, because he takes responsibility for the fact that you're still in the GSP, and your father will say, and hesitantly offer you a job as a laboratory assistant, and your mother will say, "Maxim, but you were good at drawing as a child," and Oleg will say, "How much can you do? Stop being ashamed." And Jenny will say, "Meet me, this is my husband." And everyone would be right, everyone but you. And you'll go back to the GSP department and, trying not to look at two similar idiots rummaging through the catalogs next to the bookcase, pick up another volume, open a page at random and point your finger. Before going down the cliff to the river, Maxim looked back. Behind, the grass covered with it was clumsy and straightened, the gnarled trees against the sky turned black, and the small circle of the open hatch glowed. It was all very familiar. All right, he said to himself. From everyone according to their ability. It would be nice to find a civilization, powerful, ancient, wise, and human. He went down to the water. The river was really big and slow, and I could see it descending from the east and rising to the west. The refraction here, however, is monstrous, and it was clear that the other bank was sloping and overgrown with thick reeds, and a kilometer upstream, some poles and crooked beams, skewed lattice farms, shaggy with climbing plants, were sticking out of the water. Civilization, Maxim thought without much excitement. There was a lot of iron around, and there was something else, unpleasant and stuffy, and when Maxim scooped up a handful of water, he realized that it was radiation, which was quite strong and harmful. The river was carrying radioactive substances from the east, and it became clear to Maxim that this civilization would be of little use. That again, it was not that it was better not to make contact, but to do standard tests, fly around the planet across the equator twice and get home, but on Earth, hand over the materials to the sullen, experienced uncles from the Galactic Security Commission and forget about everything as soon as possible. He squeamishly shook off his fingers and wiped them on the sand, then squatted down and thought about it. He tried to imagine the inhabitants of this planet, hardly prosperous. Somewhere beyond the forests, there was a city, hardly a prosperous city, dirty factories, decrepit reactors dumping radioactive slop into the river, ugly, wild houses under iron roofs, many walls and few windows, dirty gaps between houses littered with garbage and corpses of pets, a large ditch around the city and drawbridges. But no, that was before the reactors. And people. He tried to imagine these people but couldn't. He only knew that they were wearing a lot, they were wrapped in thick, rough cloth, and they had high white collars rubbing their chins. Then he saw footprints in the sand. They were barefoot marks. Someone came down the cliff and went into the river. Someone with big, broad feet, heavy, clubfoot, clumsy, certainly a humanoid, but he had 6 toes on his feet. Moaning and grunting, he slipped down the cliff, waddled through the sand, splashed into the radioactive waters and, snorting and snorting, swam to the other side, into the reeds. Without taking off your high white collar. A bright blue flash lit up everything around as if it had been struck by lightning, and immediately the cliff rattled, hissed, and cracked with a fiery crash. Maxim jumped up. Dry ground was falling down the cliff, something flashed through the sky with a dangerous screech and fell in the middle of the river, raising a fountain of splashes mixed with white steam. Maxim hurriedly ran up the cliff. He already knew what had happened but didn't understand why, and he wasn't surprised to see, in the place where the ship had just been parked, a swirling column of hot smoke flowing like a giant corkscrew into the phosphorescent firmament. The ship burst, the ceramite shell blazed with purple light, the dry grass around it was burning merrily, the bushes were burning, and the gnarled trees lit up with smoky lights. There was a furious fever in the face, and Maxim shielded his hand and backed away along the cliff, one step, then another step, then another and another. He backed away, keeping his watery eyes on this magnificent beauty of the hot torch, gushing with crimson and green sparks, from this sudden volcano, from the senseless riot of unbridled energy. No, why? He thought, lost his mind. A big monkey appeared and saw that I wasn't here, got inside and raised the deck. I don't know how to do it myself, but it realized that the monkey was so smart, 6-toed, she raised the deck, so she. What's in the ship's below deck? In short, she found batteries, took a big rock, and screw it. A very big rock, 3 tons in weight, and on a grand scale. Such a big monkey. After all, she finished my ship with her cobblestones, twice in the stratosphere and right here. An amazing story. It seems like this has never happened before. But what am I going to do now? Of course, they will miss me soon, but even when they miss me, they are unlikely to think that this is possible. The ship is dead and the pilot is safe. What's going to happen now? Mom. Dad. The teacher. He turned his back on the fire and walked away. He was walking quickly along the river, everything around him was red, his shadow on the grass was rushing ahead, contracting and stretching. On the right, a sparse forest smelling of prelia began, the grass became soft and moist. Two big nocturnal birds burst out loud from under their feet and pulled them to the other side low above the water. He caught a glimpse that a fire might catch up with him, and then he would have to go swimming, and that would be unpleasant, but the red light suddenly faded and went out completely, and he realized that the firefighting devices, unlike him, had figured out what was going on and fulfilled their purpose with the usual care. He vividly imagined the smoky melted cylinders sticking out ridiculously in the middle of the hot debris, emitting heavy clouds of pyrophagus and feeling very happy with themselves. Calm down, he thought. The main thing is not to flog a fever. We've got time. As a matter of fact, I have plenty of time. They can search for me ad infinitum. There is no ship and it is impossible to find me. And until they understand what happened, until they are completely convinced, until they are completely sure, they will not tell Mom anything. And I'll think of something here. He passed a small cool swamp, made his way through the bushes and found himself on the road, on an old, cracked concrete road leading into the forest. He came to the edge of the cliff, stepping on the concrete slabs, and saw rusty farms overgrown with loach, the remains of a large lattice structure half submerged in water, and on the other side there was a continuation of the road, barely visible under the glowing sky. Apparently, there used to be a bridge here. Apparently, this bridge was getting in someone's way, and it was dumped into the river, which made it neither more beautiful nor more convenient. Maxim sat on the edge of the cliff and lowered his legs. He examined himself from the inside, made sure he didn't have a fever, and began to think. I found the main thing. This is the way for you. A bad road, a rough road and an ancient road, but it's still a road, and on all habitable planets, roads lead to those who built them. What do I need? I don't need food. I mean, I would like to eat, but it's our deep instincts that we're going to suppress now. I won't need water until 24 hours later. There is enough air, although I would prefer less carbon dioxide and radioactive dirt in the atmosphere. So I don't need anything basic. And I need a small, frankly, primitive zero transmitter with a spiral path. What could be simpler than a primitive null transmitter? Just a primitive zero accumulator. He closed his eyes, and the transmitter circuit on positron emitters clearly appeared in his memory. If he had the details, he would have put this thing together in no time without opening his eyes. He mentally assembled it several times, and when he opened his eyes, the transmitter was gone. And nothing happened. Robinson, he thought with some interest. Maxim Crusoe. Wow, I don't have anything. Pocketless shorts and sneakers. But on the other hand, my island is inhabited. And since the island is inhabited, it means that there is always hope for a primitive null transmitter. He thought diligently about the null transmitter, but he wasn't good at it. He kept seeing Mom being told, "Your son is missing," and what her face was like, and how her father rubbed his cheeks and looked around in confusion, and how cold and empty they were. No, he said to himself. You're not allowed to think about that. Anything but that, or I'm not going to make it. I order and prohibit. I tell you not to think and I forbid you to think. That's it. He got up and walked down the road. The forest, at first timid and rare, gradually grew bold and came closer to the road. Some brazen young trees broke open the concrete and grew right on the highway. Apparently, the road has been around for several decades, at least it hasn't been used for several decades. The forest on the sides was getting higher, thicker, more and more muffled. In some places, tree branches intertwined overhead. It became dark, then on the right and left, loud guttural cries were heard more often. Something was moving there, rustling, trampling. 20 steps ahead, someone, squat and dark, crouched across the road. The midges rang. Maxim suddenly thought that the region was so deserted and crazy that people might not be nearby, that it would take several days to get to them. Thick instincts have aroused and reminded themselves again. But Maxim felt that there was a lot of live meat around him, that you wouldn't starve to death here, that all this was unlikely to be tasty, but it would be interesting to hunt. And since he was not allowed to think about the main thing, he began to remember how they hunted with Oleg and the huntsman Adolf with their bare hands, cunning against cunning, reason against instinct, strength against strength, without stopping for 3 days. Chase a deer through a windbreak, overtake it and knock it to the ground, grabbing it by the horns. There may be no deer here, but there is no doubt that the local game is edible. Once you think about it, distract yourself, the midges begin to eat frantically, and as you know, something edible on an alien planet won't starve to death. It would be nice to get lost here and spend a year or two wandering through the woods. If I had a buddy, a wolf or a bear, we would go hunting with him, we would talk to him. Of course, I would get tired of it after all. And it doesn't look like you can roam around in these forests with pleasure, there is too much iron around, there is nothing to breathe. And then, after all, you first need to assemble a null transmitter. He stopped listening. Somewhere in the back of the thicket, there was a monotonous dull rumble, and Maxim remembered that he had been hearing this rumble for a long time, but he had only now drawn attention to it. It was neither an animal nor a waterfall, it was a mechanism, some kind of barbaric machine. It snored, exploded, gnashed metal and spread unpleasant rusty odors. And she was getting closer. Maxim crouched down and, staying close to the side of the road, silently ran towards him, and then stopped, almost jumping straight to the intersection. Another highway crossed the road at right angles, which was very dirty, with deep, ugly tracks, with fragments of concrete sticking out, smelling bad and very, very radioactive. Maxim squatted down and looked to the left. The roar of the engine and the metal gnashing of metal were coming from there. The ground under my feet started to shudder. It was getting closer. A minute later it appeared, senselessly huge, hot, stinking, all made of riveted metal, trampling the road with monstrous caterpillars covered with mud. It did not race, it did not roll, a pearl, humpback, unkempt, rattling lagging sheets of iron, filled with raw plutonium and half with lanthanides, helpless, threatening, without people, stupid and dangerous. It rolled over the intersection and moved on, crunching and screaming the crushed concrete, leaving a tail of hot stuffiness, disappeared into the forest and everything growled, tossed and turned, roared, gradually calmed down in distance. Maxim took a breath and brushed off the midges. He was blown away. He had never seen anything so ridiculous and pathetic in his life. Yes, he thought. I can't get positron emitters here. He looked after the monster and suddenly noticed that the crossroad was not just a road, but a clearing, a narrow gap in the forest. The trees did not cover the sky above it, as they did over a highway. How about we catch up with him? He thought. Stop, extinguish the boiler. He listened. There was noise and crackling in the forest, the monster turning and turning like a hippopotamus in a quagmire, and then the roar of the engine began to approach again. It was coming back. There's more sniffing, a roar, a wave of stench, clanging and bouncing, and here it comes again, crossing the crossroads and rushing back to where it just came out. No, Maxim said. I don't want to contact him. I don't like evil animals and barbaric automatons. He waited for the monster to escape, came out of the bushes, ran away and jumped over the twisted, infected intersection with one jump. He walked very fast for some time, breathing deeply, freeing his lungs from the vapors of the iron hippopotamus, and then went on a camping step again. He thought about what he'd seen in the first 2 hours of his life on his inhabited island and tried to put all these inconsistencies and accidents into something that was logically consistent. However, it was too difficult. The picture turned out to be fabulous, not real. This forest, full of old iron, was fabulous. Fairy tale creatures echoed in it in almost human voices. Like in a fairy tale, an old abandoned road led to the enchanted castle, and invisible evil wizards tried to prevent a person from entering this country. On the far approaches, they threw meteorites at him, but it didn't work out, so they burned the ship, trapped the man, and then set an iron dragon against him. The dragon, however, turned out to be too old and stupid, and they probably already realized their mistake and are now preparing something more modern. Listen, Maxim told them. I'm not going to tear the locks up and wake up your lethargic beauties. I just want to meet one of you who's smarter, who can help me with positron emitters. But the evil wizards bent on their own. First, they placed a huge rotten tree across the highway, then destroyed the concrete pavement, dug a large hole in the ground and filled it with rotten radioactive slurry, and when that didn't help, when the midges got tired of biting and fell behind in disappointment, they let out a cold, evil fog from the forest by morning. The fog made Maxim feel chilly and started running to warm himself up. The fog was sticky, oily, smelling of wet metal and decay, but soon it smelled of smoke, and Maxim realized that there was a live fire burning nearby. It was dawn and the sky turned gray in the morning when Maxim saw a fire away from the road and a low stone building with a failed roof and empty black windows, an old one overgrown with moss. There were no people in sight, but Maxim felt that they were somewhere nearby, that they had been here recently and might be back soon. He turned off the highway, jumped over a roadside ditch and, ankle deep in rotting leaves, approached the fire. The fire greeted him with good primal warmth, which pleasantly disturbed his deep instincts. It was simple here. Without saying hello, you could squat down, reach out to the fire and wait silently for the owner to serve a hot slice and a hot mug, just as silently. The owner, however, was not present, but a smoky pot with a pungent-smelling brew hung above the fire, and at a distance there were two robes made of rough cloth, a dirty half-empty bag with straps, huge mugs of mint tin and some other iron objects for unknown purposes. Maxim sat by the fire, warmed himself up, looking at the fire, then got up and went into the house. Actually, only a stone box remains from the house. The morning sky brightened through the broken beams above my head. It was scary to step on the rotten floorboards, and clusters of raspberry mushrooms grew in the corners, poisonous, but if they were thoroughly roasted, they were quite usable. However, the thought of eating immediately disappeared when Maxim saw someone's bones mixed with faded rags in the dark against the wall. He felt bad. He turned around, went down the destroyed steps and, with his hands folded with a mouthpiece, yelled at the whole forest, "Oh, six-toed!" The echo got stuck in the fog between the trees almost immediately. No one responded, only some birdies cluttered angrily and excitedly above my head. Maxim returned to the fire, threw branches into the fire and looked into the pot. The brew was boiling. He looked around, found something like a spoon, smelled it, wiped it off with the grass, and smelled it again. Then he carefully removed the grayish scum and shook it to the embers. He stopped the brew, scooped it up from the edge, blew it out and, with his lips stretched out, tried it. It turned out to be nice, something like tahorga liver soup, only spicier. Maxim put down the spoon, gently, with both hands, removed the pot and put it on the grass. Then he looked around again and said out loud, "Breakfast is ready." He could not help feeling that the owners were somewhere nearby, but he saw only bushes still, wet with the fog, black gnarled tree trunks, and he only heard the crackling of the fire and the troublesome bird roll call. "All right," he said out loud. "Whatever you want, I'm starting to contact you." It got a taste very quickly. Either the spoon was big, or his deep instincts were playing out of moderation, but before he knew it, he was sipping a third of the pot. Then he moved away with regret, sat down, listening to his taste, carefully wiped the spoon off, but could not resist and once again scooped up these mouth-watering brown slices, melting in his mouth, similar to sea cucumbers, moved away completely, wiped the spoon again and put it across the pot. Now was the time to satiate gratitude. He jumped up, picked out a few thin twigs and went into the house. Carefully walking on the rotten boards and trying not to look back at the remains in the shade, he began picking mushrooms and stringing crimson hats onto the twig, choosing the strongest ones. He thought, add some salt and pepper, but that's okay, it'll do for the first contact anyway. We'll hang you above the light and all your active organic matter will ferry out of you, and you will become a treat, and you will be my first contribution to the culture of this inhabited island, and positron emitters will be second. Suddenly the house became a little bit darker, and he immediately felt that they were looking at him. In time, he suppressed his desire to turn abruptly, counted to 10, got up slowly and turned his head slowly, smiling in advance. A long dark face with dull big eyes, with sadly lowered lips, looked at him through the window. It looked at him without any interest, without spite and without joy. It looked not at a person from another world, but at a boring pet that had climbed again, wherever it was not told. They looked at each other for a few seconds, and Maxim felt the despondency coming from this face flooding the house, overwhelming the forest, and the whole planet, and the whole world around him, and everything around him had become gray, dull and deplorable. Everything had already happened, and it had happened many times, and there would be many times, and there would be no escape from this gray, dull, deplorable boring women. Then the house got even darker and Maxim turned to the door. There, with his strong short legs apart and the entire opening with his broad shoulders, stood a stocky man in an ugly checkered jumpsuit, completely overgrown with red hair. Through the lush red thickets, Maxim was looked at by glowing blue eyes, very fixed, very unkind and yet kind of cheerful, perhaps in contrast to the worldwide despondency emanating from the window. This hairy young guy is also clearly not the first time he has seen aliens from another world, but he is used to dealing with these annoying aliens quickly, coolly and decisively, without any contacts or other unnecessary difficulties. He had a thick metal pipe of the most ominous kind around his neck from a leather belt, and he directed the exhaust hole of this alien crime weapon directly into Maxim's stomach with a firm, dirty hand. It was immediately clear that he had never heard of the supreme value of human life, the Declaration of Human Rights, or the other magnificent inventions of supreme humanism, or humanism itself, and if you told him about these things, he wouldn't believe it. However, Maxim did not have to choose. He held out a twig with mushroom hats strung in front of him, smiled even wider and said with exaggerated articulation, "Peace. Friendship." The sad person outside the window responded to this slogan with a long, illegible phrase, then cleared the contact area and, judging by the sounds outside, began piling dry branches into the fire. The blue-eyed man's tousled red beard began to move, and roaring, clanging sounds rushed from the copper thicket, vividly reminding Maxim of the Iron Dragon at the crossroads. "Yes," Maxim said, nodding vigorously. "Earth. Cosmos." He poked his twig at the zenith, and the red-bearded man glanced obediently at the broken ceiling. "Maxim," Maxim continued, poking himself in the chest. "Maxim. My name is Maxim." To make it more convincing, he hit himself in the chest like an angry gorilla. "Maxim." "Ma Sim," the red-bearded man barked with a strange accent. Keeping an eye on Maxim, he let out a series of rumbling and clanging sounds over his shoulder, repeating the word Ma Sim several times, in response to which the invisible, dull personality began to emit terribly dreary phonemes. The red-bearded man's blue eyes rolled out, his yellow-toothed mouth opened, and he gagged. Obviously, the humor of the situation, unknown to Maxim, has finally reached the red-bearded man. Laughing, the red-bearded man wiped his eyes with his free hand, put down his deadly weapon and gave Maxim an unambiguous sign that meant, "Well, come out." Maxim gladly obeyed. He went out onto the porch and again handed the red-bearded mushroom twig. The red-bearded man took the twig, turned it around like this, smelled it and threw it aside. No. Maxim objected. "You'll lick my fingers." He bent down and picked up the twig. The Redbeard didn't mind. He patted Maxim on the back, pushed him to the fire, then fell on his shoulder by the fire, sat him down and began to explain something. But Maxim didn't listen. He looked at the depressed man. He sat across the street and dried a large dirty cloth in front of the fire. He had one foot bare and moved his fingers all the time, and he had 5 toes. 5, not 6 at all.